Inches high, 18 inches wide, but there was one final barrier. The back of the metal cabinet that housed the deposit boxes lay right in front of it, bolted to both the floor and ceiling. They tried, using their hydraulic pump again, complete with 10-ton ram, to lever it forward. It strained, it creaked, but the cabinet wouldn't budge. Eventually, bang. The Sealy pump broke. It was hissing, that pump, Perkins would say later. Bang. That's all I could hear. Bang. He considered the situation. For F's sake, how would they get through now? What about the holiday for his daughter? What about the house for his kids? He was tired. He had a headache. Outside, the sun was up. It was April 3rd. Good Friday. Tomorrow was his 67th birthday. Kenny Collins, the lookout, Priscilla Coleman, yes. Okay. He fell asleep. But he was, in his defense, very tired. Kenny Collins may have been, as his colleague in crime Terry Perkins would sometimes say, not the cleverest but he knew what was risky and what wasn't. And holding on to this stuff felt risky. Granted, he may not have shown in his job as lookout on that first night. Getting into 25 Hatton Garden had been easy enough. And from the floor he was on, he had a clear view of both doors to 88 to 90 Hatton Garden and was poised, walkie-talkie in hand, to let them know if there was even a sniff of the old bill. He let them know, for instance, when that security guard started poking around. And yet, well, it was a long night. And at 75, he was not a young man anymore, and so, as his friend Danny Jones, the nut, would later say, Ken, you only sat up in the FING room and fell asleep, yes. Okay. He fell asleep. But he was, in his defense, very tired. Currently, he was with Jones, and they were driving to the meeting point for the slaughter, where all that recognizable gold in countless necklaces and rings could be smelted down. Then, he could finally get his money, which he more than deserved. It was him, after all, who drove
Jones to Twickenham that Saturday morning in his Mercedes to get another hydraulic pump from Machine Mart, a Clark this time, after the Sealy had broken and they'd had to pull out, as he said to Jones, never give up. The old saying comes round. Never give up, I agree, said Jones. Why should you give up? But some had given up. The master, for one. The master. He never thought they'd get in, so he left them high and dry, and Carl Wood, the odd job man with the Dickie Bowels, copied him. There's only one thing you'd give that up for, Collins said. One reason ever. He must have thought we would never get in. It's the only reason you wouldn't come back in it. And Carl copied him, said Jones. Arsehole, said Perkins, chipping in. Carl's arsehole fell out, said Jones. Carl's different, clarified Perkins. His arsehole went, his arsehole, meaning the master's arsehole, Collins noted, never went. He thought we'd never get in. No, that's right, agreed Jones. He thought we would never get in. And Carl's arsehole went, but get in they did. They had returned to Hatton Garden at just past 10 p.m. on Saturday night. It was Perkins' birthday and he was about to open his present. He was so happy once they finally broke through the cabinet, he'd later say, he even considered taking a selfie. He eventually decided against it. Just 2 hours earlier, jeweler Lionel J. Whiffen had popped in with his wife to tidy, ahead of a visit by an electrician due the day after. He noticed the door to the courtyard was open and made a mental note to have a go at the caretaker, who'd clearly given the keys to someone new. He left an hour later. Inside, the new pump soon did the trick, and Jones and Basil, the two most live, squeezed through the hole and started crowbarring open the boxes. They knew what they were looking for. Don't bother with the big ones, it was the smaller boxes that would contain briefcases of precious stones. They knew, also, that Hatton Garden was less than reputable. That had always been part of the appeal, but the things they came across. One box alone, for instance, contained £1.6 million worth of gold bullion and £70,000 in cash. Countless others had antique jewelry, cash bundles, loose stones, gold bars, everything you could think of. There were rumors that drug dealers kept boxes here. Others, the court would later hear, belonged to Hatton Garden jewelry dealers whose entire businesses were in these boxes. 2 small rooms were available, just outside the vault, for potential trades or purchases. Make your own mind up how much of it got declared to the tax man. Not a great deal was thought to be insured. When news of the burglary broke, the police even said they would probably never know how much was stolen. Such was the secretive nature of the box holders. Safety deposit boxes are used for a number of reasons, former flying squad detective Barry Phillips said. And one of them is anonymity. Some of it was even speculated to be the spoils of previous burglaries the robbers robbed. Many, it would later emerge, weren't even keeping up with the rent. 182 were on the drilling list, people who hadn't paid in over a year and would soon be drilled into. Perkins' daughter was once ripped off by a Hatton Garden trader who'd used a fake stone in her engagement ring and so said to her father, "They deserve all they get, Dad. They are all riffraff down there." The contents of other boxes were downright strange. One just contained a passport. Another, a tape recorder. Another still, simply war medals, while the oddest contained a solitary cassette tape, which was labeled as a confession. All of this they left behind. When GQ asked the Met if the tape was the subject of a criminal inquiry, they called it a total red herring, adding, it was listened to, and the title on the tape was infinitely more interesting than its content. Still, they got their fill. Some £14 million, all told, from 56 boxes, before they finally left just before 7 a.m. on Easter Sunday. But that was when the real problems began, what to do with it. Collins, for one, was terrified. So terrified, the day after the job, he stashed some of it in casserole dishes in his kitchen cupboards. Jones had put some in his brother's loft and booby-trapped it. Perkins had his stored around the house. These were not long-term solutions. Eventually, they decided to consolidate it and melt it down. Their key mistake, however, was allowing Collins to look after logistics. He gave the heaving bags of gold to Billy the Fish Lincoln, so called because of his regular visits to Billingsgate Fish Market, to look after, and Lincoln had then given it to someone else. The news did not go down well. There was a bloke who I never knew, which was Bill, said Perkins to Jones about it. And Kenny had told him everything. And he had given it to someone else to look after. I said all them big stones are already gone. I said that's what you've done. Think of it, Dan. There are two people now, with no need to know, who now know, as Jones would say, not the cleverest still, the plan now was relatively simple, or at least as simple as things could be when Collins was involved. Lincoln would give the bags to his nephew, John Harbinson, a taxi driver who didn't know what was in them, to hand them back at a meet-up point so they could melt the gold down. They chose the old Wheatsheaf pub in Enfield, near the workshop of a local plumber called Hugh Doyle, who gave his blessing. Perkins was worried. This was not a good plan. All they needed was a police car to pass by. That's where he is half a FING idiot, Perkins had said to Jones some days before. He is a FING idiot, clarified Jones. Collins was driving his white Mercedes to the meet-up point, with Jones in the passenger seat. It was nearly 10 a.m. on May 19th. My Matthew works for the Dustmen. He brings home $260 a week, said Jones, apparently just making chit-chat, but really giving the reason he did it, and why he was taking the risk now. Like the rest, he wanted to help out his kids. This is what elderly burglars do. Takes home, asked Collins. Yeah, said Jones. He gets paid about 3 and a bit. He's been there a FING year. There was a pause. There's the old Wheatsheaf, said Collins. They did the handover, and Jones, Collins, and Perkins all went to a house in Sterling Road, Enfield. Small 2-up 2-down terrace. It was the house of Perkins' daughter, 35-year-old Terry Robinson. Daughter he wanted to get a holiday for. Just as they were standing at her dining table, a smelter set to melt millions of pounds worth of precious metals. The police burst through the door with a battering ram. They'd been watching them for weeks. Collins and Perkins were caught instantly and bundled on the sofa. Jones, who ran marathons, made a sprint for it, but was tackled in the garden. When they were put in custody, they pretended they'd never met, despite just being in a house together. Yet, when Collins later heard the bugged recordings they'd made, in which he practically admitted to it all, he didn't even ask for bail. Instead, he just asked for a cup of tea. Maybe they were right. Not the cleverest, was he? Carl Wood, the dropout, Priscilla Coleman, in court, Wood heard covert recordings of his friends calling him cowardly, as Carl Wood sat in the dock in Woolwich Crown Court in early January 2016, awaiting the verdict 9 months after being arrested at his home. He could probably give you a list of the indignities he had suffered. But one was the worst, sitting behind glass in the dock, now bearded and bespectacled, each day wearing a different V-neck jumper over an open-neck shirt, looking like a grumpy geography teacher now, rather than a cheesed-off traffic warden. He was always the first let in, as if to prove he'd screwed up the most. Sure, he might have reflected as he sat there, all the others on
The job that, first night, apart from Basil, his friend Danny Jones, kindly Terry Perkins, that idiot Kenny Collins, the master, had already admitted their guilt and were awaiting sentencing. But as the Crown's barrister, Philip Evans, pointed out on the first day, there was said to be at least £10 million of the loot still out there. 10 years for robbery, would new, with a third off if you admitted it. Not an awful deal with millions waiting. But he had walked away, so he had nothing. Less than nothing, actually, still £22,000 in debt. It would have solved all his problems if he'd been smart. Granted, not everyone had been. That nut Jones had gone to the trouble of burying his jewels in 2 cemetery plots, only to write a letter about it to Martin Brunt at Sky News. Jones led the police there. The idea, presumably, was that by giving the police one lot, they wouldn't look for a second one. Wrong. All he did was let the police know he'd buried jewels in that cemetery. Both plots were for relatives of his partner, Valerie. When they took him there, the police had already dug up the main plot and so simply let Jones lead them to the other one, but that humiliation was nothing compared to this. Who else might have reflected, had to listen to covert recordings, played in open court, of your friends gleefully calling you a cowardly idiot, and saying that your arsehole had fallen out. Jones was heard speculating that would have to hit the bottle. I bet he is boozing now, Perkins, that he'd have to ponder suicide. He must be thinking of suicide. They even imagined him begging them for money. Oh, said Perkins, doing an impression, can I have a bit of money for some shopping? Humiliating. In the dock with him were the ones who got involved afterwards. The bulldog brought William Lincoln to his left, who took the bags from Collins and kept having to ask the volume to be turned up on his headphones to hear the judge. He suffered from incontinence and had soiled himself at the police station after being arrested. To the left of Lincoln was John Harbinson, the taxi driver who had moved the loot and would later be acquitted. He looked like Steve Davis and seemingly wore the same white shirt every day. Finally, Hugh Doyle, whose plumbing business was the meet-up point. He was up for a lesser charge: conspiracy to conceal, convert or transfer criminal property, and so was on bail. He would regularly chat to the journalists when the court wasn't sitting. Every day, he wore the branded t-shirt of his plumbing business, Associated Response. Why? Asked one journalist. Free advertising, came the reply. Why? Someone would want to use a plumber done for. Handling stolen goods to fix their toilet was a question no one really wanted to ask. Some journalists even made bets on whether the court artist would pick out the specific logo in their sketch. Sadly, they did not. Court time, mostly, was slow time, and would often sat and read the Daily Mail. But there were moments of levity. Like the time, after suggesting Jones' Googling of a diamond-tipped drill could have been for any crime, that a barrister said, Mr. Jones views his profession as professional burglar with some enthusiasm. No shit. Or Bill, the Fish, Lincoln, describing why his friend was called Jimmy, 2 baths, he stays all day at the spa, often having 2 baths. The press gallery giggled at that one. Some things, when the court was out of session, didn't see. Like the time during a particularly boring interrogation of a mobile phone mast expert, Harbinson's defense counsel, Philip Sinclair, a portly man with an eye patch, who wore a fresh rose on his lapel every day, could be heard, outside in the corridor, pleading with Crown Barrister Philip Evans, don't make me go out there and cross-examine him, or the time when the court was temporarily out of session that Wood's own counsel, Nicholas Corsellis who looked like he could have been Benedict Cumberbatch's older brother, was seen making the universal, I'm watching you, gesture, popularized by Robert De Niro in Meet the Parents, to where the judge would have been sitting, before elaborately motioning the snapping of an imaginary pencil. His fellow lawyers found it very funny. Still, mostly, it was no joke. After the first day, the Mirror ran the story on their front page, the Diamond Dummies. It was hard to disagree. Where to begin? The fact they always had their phones on them, for starters. The police had complete records of their movements for months. Or that Danny had Googled the drills on his own computer. That the master had used a friend's Oyster card. And the things they found at their houses. Jones had kept his copy of Forensics for Dummies, along with tools and face masks. The master, a man hoping to dissociate himself from a diamond heist, had 2 diamond gauges, a diamond gauge/weight tester, a diamond tester, and a non-fiction book called The Diamond Underworld. Wood may have lost his nerve, but they found nothing incriminating at his house. Jones had even given his own surname and address when buying the second pump. V. Jones of Park Avenue, Enfield, Middlesex, he wrote, giving his wife's initial and seemingly thinking it was the perfect cover. But worst of all had been that idiot Collins, who, after picking up the pump with Jones, had driven his own distinctive white Mercedes back to Hatton Garden. It didn't take long for the police to get onto them from there, and they traced back the movements of all their cars. As he heard said more than once, they were analog criminals in a digital age, hopelessly out of their depth. Basil, who was supposed to be the technical one, hadn't even put all the CCTV cameras out of action, as he was supposed to. One of them had recorded everything. And it goes without saying they never suspected they had been bugged, but maybe the greatest humiliation Woods may have pondered came when he had taken the stand. No, he was forced to admit, he couldn't work much. Yes, his condition, Crohn's, meant he was in constant pain. Yes, he owed a lot of money, £3,000 to NatWest, £8,000 to Barclaycard, £2,000 to Mitsubishi, £9,000 to a friend. Worse still was that they knew about the call he'd made on April 7th, the first working day after the bank holiday weekend, the earliest he could have made it after the raid. Just days after some of his elderly friends, the Diamond Geezers as the press would call them, had sorted their pensions with one last job or secured the future for their kids and grandchildren, that £10 million still out there somewhere. Carl Wood made a call to arrange to start paying off his massive debts at the only rate that would be possible. He arranged to start paying it off at £1 a day. The judge told him to stand guilty. He would later be sentenced to 6 years. CCTV cameras caught the burglars entering and leaving several times on the Easter bank holiday weekend of 2015, between 9:28 p.m. on April 2nd and 6:43 a.m. on April 5th. The gang covered their faces and believed they had deleted all this footage before they left for the last time. Secure facilities. Getty Images. Please do not smoke in the vault. Getty Images. Entry by lift to the basement vault had been blocked by metal shutters since the 70s, until the robbers raised it with a hydraulic jack. Angle grinders cut through the bars to this locked door. The 10-inch, diamond-tipped drill allowed the burglars to bypass a more secure door by penetrating the reinforced concrete wall instead. Hatton Garden heist. How it happened. The building where the theft took place contained a number of businesses, each sharing a communal entrance. The safety deposit firm was in the basement. Stage 1. The gang entered the building through a communal entrance. Stage 2. They disabled the communal lift on the second floor. Stage 3. The lift shaft gave access to the basement by abseil. Stage 4. The basement's shutter doors were forced open. Stage 5. A heavy-duty drill bored a hole just wide enough to gain access to the vault. Stage 6. After the raid, the vault was covered in dust and debris and the floor strewn with discarded safety deposit boxes and power tools, including an angle grinder, concrete drills and crowbars. Thank you. Please like, share, subscribe.